Gregory was born right around the same time as Augustine of Hippo. Thank you, by the way, for letting us know that you couldn't hear us. His dates are 335 of the Common Era to 395. He also lived during a time when the church had already, as you can see, his date 335, the church was already being given freedom by the empire, and in 380 of the Common Era, it's actually recognized as the religion. The Catholic Church is the religion of the Roman Empire. So Gregory's living in that latter part of the transition to Christianity becoming the imperial religion. He's also really interesting in that he's born to a very large and prosperous family in Asia Minor, what was called Asia Minor back then, which is present-day Turkey. And he's born somewhere in the central part of what we would call Turkey today. And he had a very renowned older brother, Basil the Great, who is one of the great, what they call Cappadocian theologians. Gregory of Nyssa would be another one, and then Gregory of Nazianzus would be the third, who was a friend of theirs. So those three in particular are very renowned theologians. And Gregory of Nyssa was the younger brother of Basil the Great. So, it's luckily he wasn't called Gregory the Lesser, Basil the Great and Gregory the also ran. But his sister actually says this to him. His sister Macrina, who was also older than he was, she was the oldest child. She says to him right before she dies, he had been made bishop by then, and she said, and you have lots to give thanks for, like you were made bishop, even given your paucity of talent. I'm like, gee, thanks, sis. That was really nice. So he was not seen by his contemporaries as being the bright light. That honor would go to Basil. He was also a bit of a reluctant Christian. During this era, virginity was a very highly valued quality. Augustine himself lamented the fact that he was not a virgin. Gregory of Nyssa is going to have a similar lament. And so Basil, on the other hand, was a virgin, and so was his sister Macrina. So that would be another reason he wasn't the great, I guess. And he really wasn't really interested in the church all that much in his youth. So he was a reader in the family chapel. The family was very well off, so they had their own chapel. But then he just got interested in rhetoric. We saw the same thing with Augustine. And became a professor of rhetoric and started a career in that way and got married. And this, of course, caused him great consternation later. So later on in his life, he does, in fact, feel very drawn to Christianity, which means he would also be drawn very strongly to freedom from passion. In fact, the mark of a Christian in this era, especially in Gregory's mind, but this would also be true for Augustine and Athanasius, is freedom from passion. And by passion, they don't mean desire, because as we'll see, in Gregory's mind, our desire for God is infinite, right? He never talks about our heart resting the way Augustine did. It's not restless, but it's never at rest. So the human being for Gregory is always moving. You're either moving deeper into God or further away from God. But so to be free from passion is not to be free from desire. It's to be free from the things that really destroy human relationships and our relationship with God. And the passion from which you want to be the most free is envy, right? Is envy. The devil, according to Gregory, brought envy into the world. That's the devil caused human beings to sin because of our envy. And from envy comes every other evil: hatred, gossip, malicious speech, murder, adultery, the whole bit. And envy then comes from, and we'll see how he tries to address this in his understanding of God, envy comes from the thinking that there's a finite amount of good. And if somebody else has that good and I don't have it, then I have to get it from that somebody else, right? I envy that. We have a difficult time seeing envy as a destructive passion because our entire economy, and I'm serious, is built on envy. Capitalism is built on envy. Don't you want what that person has? Why don't you have it? Right? Well, if you don't have it, go take it, right? So anyway, so it's very interesting. Sexual passion, though, would be another thing from which you want to be freed, and that obviously our era disagrees with that value. But the deeper passions with which they were interested were things like envy. And for Gregory, envy is really the consuming passion that leads to all others. I think that's a really interesting psychological insight, actually. And his sister then, so Basil the Great was the educated Christian, And when Gregory decides to become more involved in Christianity, he studies under his brother, right? And he and his wife enter into a celibate relationship and turn their household into a kind of monastery. And then Gregory enters the monastery that his brother founded, and right near the family estate. And then his brother teaches him theology. So it's really interesting. So in terms of his thinking, his brother Basil was his great teacher in terms of Christian thought. But in terms of living, his sister Macrina was his teacher. And she was a remarkable person. She was taught by her mother. Her mother was a very devout woman. We don't know much about their father. The women seem to rule the roost in a way. But his sister was the oldest of the siblings, and she was taught by her mother, not in rhetoric and classical literature or anything like that, but in the Psalms and in Proverbs. So she was taught very practical wisdom, Macrina was. And it shaped her so that she actually thought, can you imagine, that what you hear, you should actually do, right? So she wasn't enamored of highly speculative thinking and things like that. She thought that discipleship meant living the way Jesus called us to live. And so she had this incredible ability to concentrate her activity around that subject matter, and as a consequence, lived a life free of passion. Jesus says, at least according to Gregory, Jesus says in the Gospels, when the Sadducees tried to trick him and say, this woman married a husband and he died, and then she married another husband and he died, and married another brother and he died, and there are 7 of them, I believe. In the resurrection, who will be her husband? Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. In the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. They become like angels. They become like angels. So the Christian life, according to Macrina and Gregory, is to become like an angel, right? And so angels don't procreate. Angels don't have procreative organs. And so for this period, you want to become as much as you can like an angel. And the monastic life, we'll talk about this during Advent, the monastic life was seen as a way to, in fact, achieve as much as you can in this life of the angelic life. This is a text which just dominates the first 1,000 or so years of Christianity. We barely know Jesus said anything like it. But to their mind, this was the goal. What do you want to be when you grow up? An angel. And not an angel, when the kids get killed in a school bus crash, they all become angels automatically. No, you become an angel by freeing yourself from passion, right? So Macrina very much took this seriously. And she really impressed her brother. The way that she was most impressive was there was a series of deaths that took place in their family, beginning with Gregory's older brother. And he became a hermit and then died suddenly, just completely unexpectedly. And it was devastating to the family. His mother was devastated. Gregory himself was devastated. Basil was devastated. Macrina was not. She grieved, but she was actually so free from passion. Passion leads you to grieve overwhelmingly when you lose something you were going to lose anyway. She had so detached herself from that kind of love that she actually turned her attention to Gregory and her mother and Basil and others and comforted them in their affliction. See, when you're free from passion, it doesn't mean you're indifferent. It means you can actually pay attention to people in need other than yourself. So she was so underwhelmed by her own grief that she could attend to the grief of others. It's really amazing. And that's when Gregory's like, wow, this woman really has something here. Then her mother died, right? Same thing, they were devastated. And in fact, Macrina goes about doing the same thing, and in fact, winds up running the household for her mother. So, and then Basil himself dies. And Gregory was very distraught by this. In fact, he goes to see his sister. She's now living in a monastery herself. He goes to see his sister, and she's dying. She's lying. It's incredible, the scene that he paints. He comes into her room, and she's lying on a board with another board for a pillow, right? So this is, if you've been to the Ephrata cloister, they slept similarly, right? So you're sleeping in, which we did this morning. That is not what they're about, right? They don't have big, mattresses and things like that. He comes to see her, and she's apparently dying of cancer from what I can tell from her symptoms. She's in an extreme amount of pain. And instead of dwelling on herself, she comforts Gregory over the death of Basil the Great, right? So she focuses all of her attention on him and his grief. It's really quite amazing. So she was an amazing person, and he calls her the teacher. In fact, he wrote 2 dialogues with her after she died, one on the soul and the resurrection, and the other on the making of humanity, these 2 treatises. And she's the teacher, and then he asks her questions. Now, a lot of this is probably him putting words in her mouth, but still, the fact that he would honor his sister this way and calling her the teacher is really quite significant, it seems to me. Well, he was made bishop by his brother in 372 to help combat the Arians, so the people who are denying the divinity of Christ are still around. And he himself played a rather large role in that, which they were finally vindicated at the Council of Constantinople in 381, which is a year after Theodosius makes Christianity, or the Catholic Church, the religious organization in the empire, and starts to marginalize the Jews in particular. And it was only after that, only after 381, that Gregory, and his sister obviously has died by then as well, that Gregory starts writing his own theological works. So what we're talking about today, and the quotes you have today from the life of Moses, comes from this period after 381. And he died, Gregory died somewhere around 395, we think. And so he was very prolific up until that time. He has a major influence. The life of Moses was very influential on how people came, especially in Greek-speaking territory, came to understand how we come to know God. So it feeds right into the topic for this course. And also his commentary on the Song of Songs is one of the major influences on Greek mystical theology. We'll talk about that next time with Suda Dionysius. So he's a very influential theologian, even though he wasn't the great, right? So this is a good thing. So younger brothers who aren't the great can still do okay. So this is, I was the 4th in line, so there's hope for all of us, right? So that's just to give you an overview of his life. So he was a married man who became celibate, and his wife became celibate. It was a consensual thing. So he focuses for the rest of his life on this freedom from passion. But he also focuses very much on how it is that human beings come to know God. And he knows that we come to know the unknowable God, right? So how is it possible for human beings to come to know God? This is a question that very much preoccupies him. Well, he builds his cases, and we've seen this with virtually every other theologian we've looked at so far, where he builds his case based on the fact that we are created in the image of God. And that for him means that we participate in what he calls the energies of God. I love that term. It's different than the attributes. We talk about divine attributes, and that's fine. You know, divine attributes be able goodness, wisdom, justice, mercy, etc. But for Gregory, these are energies. These are things that are at work in the world that you experience, right? And so for human beings to be created in the image of God means that the energies of God live in us. Our existence is our participation in these energies of God. And he says at one point, not in the handout I gave you, he says, if you exclude from life the benefits which come from God, and these benefits would be these energies, you will have no way of recognizing the divine, right? So if you exclude our participation in the energies of God, you can't know anything about God. So he's actually going to start his understanding of the knowledge of God with ourselves, right? With our own nature, with our own experience of the benefits we experience in this life. And then he's going to work from there by analogy and anagogy, right? So these are the 2 moves he makes. Analogy is similarity with difference, and anagogy is raising something to a whole different level of existence. So, which analogy wouldn't necessarily do. You know, you could be like another creature. So that would be an analogy. But the anagogy would be for a creature to be like the creator. That you're dealing with a whole different order of existence, but you're still dealing with similarity because we're created in the image of God. There's one quote from again another work in which he lays this out pretty clearly. He says, in humanity, we observe a certain kind of power and life and wisdom. But by using the same words, no one would attribute to God the same life, power, and wisdom as ours. Rather are such expressions reduced in meaning to correspond to the measure of our nature, which is finite, corruptible, etc. For since our nature is corruptible and weak, for this reason our life is fleeting, our power unsubstantial, and our reason unstable. In reference, however, to the transcendent nature, everything said of it is raised to a higher degree by virtue of the greatness of the object we contemplate. It doesn't, so he's not saying these things don't tell us anything about God. It just says, keep in mind, our reason is unstable, our nature is transient, etc. So when we talk about God, we raise it to a higher degree. He says elsewhere, our knowledge of God comes from applying to a raised degree, anagogikos, our own attributes to the transcendent nature, right? So, but we start with our experience of the good things we experience in our life. We identify those as reason and wisdom and goodness and justice and mercy, etc. And then we realize the limitations of those in our own lives, but then we ascribe them without limitation to the divine. So he also talks about this in terms of every excellent attribute, every idea of excellence is attributed to God, right? So you elevate your concepts from your experience of these things in this life. I think that's really interesting, though. You start with your own experience of these things in your life, and then you elevate them to the divine. Moreover, the divine is all of these things simultaneously. So we are sometimes just, sometimes not, sometimes merciful, sometimes not, etc. Sometimes wise, sometimes foolish. God is wisdom itself, which is also life itself, which is also eternity itself, which is also love itself, etc. So God is also all of these things in one, whereas we tend to experience these things in diverse ways. Well, if you do elevate all of these things to the level of excellence, and this brings us then to the first quote, realize that the divine is goodness itself, right? And if the divine is not like we are, which is limited and finite, then this goodness must be infinite. And it must be infinite because what makes something finite is the way it's bounded by its opposite, right? So light is bounded by darkness, life is bounded by death, wisdom is bounded by ignorance, and goodness is bounded by evil, right? So if God were comprehensible, if God were finite in any way, then God would be bounded by evil. And evil would be greater than God, right? So if God is bounded in any way, then that means evil is more comprehensive than goodness is, right? Well, this is impossible according to Gregory, right? Because A, God can't be bounded, and B, evil doesn't exist. Because anything that exists is good. We just talked about that. Your own existence reveals God to you, right? So if something exists, it's good. So to say evil exists is an oxymoron. So what is evil? Well, just to say is attributes the wrong thing to evil. Evil does not exist. So the only way God's nature would be limited is if evil existed. And of course, the Manichaeans and the Gnostics are saying this, that there's an evil deity out there who's warring with the true God. But for Gregory, that's completely mistaken, that God is not bounded by anything, including evil. So the very first quote sets this out, and this becomes the basis of everything else Gregory's going to say. It's really quite remarkable. So in the very first quote on the page I handed out for today, the divine one is himself the good, in the primary and proper sense of the word, whose very nature is goodness. This he is, and he is so named, and is known by this nature. Since then, it has not been demonstrated that there is any limit to virtue, which would be another word for goodness, except evil. And since the divine does not admit of an opposite, we hold the divine nature to be unlimited and infinite. Right? So the divine nature is unlimited and infinite. And Gregory is one of the best theologians I've ever read to penetrate into what the infinity of God would mean. Right? We say that often, God is infinite. But what does it really mean that God is infinite? God is infinite goodness. And then he talks about the book, The Life of Moses is written about the life of virtue. And so he says, certainly whoever pursues true virtue participates in nothing other than God, because God is himself absolute virtue. And then this we'll see how this plays out. Since then, those who know what is good by nature desire participation in it. So we want to live more and more into the good that we come to see. And since this good has no limit, the participant's desire itself necessarily has no stopping place, no point of rest, but stretches out with the limitless, right? So the human participation in God is infinite. It will never stop. So the more you increase in your participation in the energies of God, the more you'll be able to participate even more in the energies of God, and there will be no stopping point. Yes. So the question was, for those at home, sometimes I can't hear, we're talking as though good and evil are mutually exclusive, but in our own lives they're not. That we on the one hand, we're called to a life of godliness, and on the other hand, we keep sinning, right? But with faith in Christ, we're forgiven. Where does sin come from? And why do we keep persisting in it? Is that a fair summary of your question?
Sure.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Well, I spoke before. I mean, we're talking about the divine nature, right? So the divine nature is goodness itself without any evil. That's certainly not a description of human nature, and nor is it a description of the devil's nature, because the devil brought envy into the world, right? And through envy came death and sin, etc. So the question becomes, if that's the case, if God is infinite goodness, how is it at all possible to sin? And it's a really good question, actually. One of the energies that God has above all others is free will. And one of the energies which he absolutely must give humanity, for humanity to be like God, is free choice of the will, right? So the human being, we've seen this all the way through, the human being has the ability to determine the direction of his or her trajectory. And there are only two. You're either going toward the infinite goodness of God, and you'll go that way infinitely, so there's never an end to that trail, or you're going away from the infinite goodness of God, and there is an end to that trajectory. It's called nothingness, right? So you're either going toward the infinite good, or you're going toward nothing. And the direction is yours to choose. God will not override your choice. Why in the world would you choose non-being? Why would you choose death as opposed to life? Why would you choose a curse instead of a blessing, right? How did we get into this mess? Well, through the envy of the devil saw, oh my goodness, these mortal creatures are going to be immortal with God. They're going to participate in God by the image of God. I envy that. There's only so much goodness to go around. You see, the devil already closed his eyes to the goodness of God. And then envy arose in his heart. And then he leads the human beings to sin. How? By leading them to what Gregory calls thoughtlessness. He said, oh no, it's good if you eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, because then you'll be like God. Well, was it good? No. But he conceals the evil like we conceal pills for dogs in food, right? And this is exactly Gregory's image. He conceals the bitter pill of sin in this apparent good. So why do we sin? We misjudge what goodness is. We're thoughtless, right? I think that's really interesting. So the devil's sin is envy, which leads humans to their sin, which is thoughtlessness, right? So the reason we sin is we misjudge what the real good is. Like we think getting drunk and having lots of sex is good, right? But actually it's only an apparent good. It's not the true good because it doesn't abide, right? You wake up the next day and you're still the same mess, maybe even more than you were before, right? So your question's really excellent. And it brings us to why God revealed I am that I am on Mount Sinai to Moses. So the human sin for Gregory takes place by means of thoughtlessness. And it doesn't just mean, it's not the kind of thoughtlessness that is remedied by a good education, right? Necessarily. It's misjudging what the true good is compared to the apparent good. And we can see that actually in the paragraph number 23, which is, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down on the front of the sheet. This is what Gregory's interpretation of why God reveals the divine name to Moses, I am that I am. He says, in my view, the definition of truth is this: not to have a mistaken apprehension of being. Falsehood is a kind of impression which arises in the understanding about non-being, as though what does not exist does in fact exist, right? But truth is the sure apprehension of real being. Okay, so he then says later on, even the philosopher will barely apprehend what true being is, that is what possesses existence in its own nature. And what non-being is, that is what is existence only in appearance with no self-subsisting nature. Now that doesn't mean that these things don't exist. It means that they don't exist in a way that makes them true, right? So truth is the sure apprehension of being, and being is that which is what it is. So when God reveals to Moses, I am that I am, Gregory takes us to mean in a spiritual way that this is the revelation of true being, and that's what truth is. There's a question there. It's a really interesting question. I'm trying really hard to integrate it into what I'm trying to do, and I'm having. I think that the whole in Gregory's thinking, the whole thing founders on thinking that the greatest good is this life, right? So if you think the greatest good is this life and not eternal life, then you're going to get into arguments about who's water. I mean, we're going to be, by the way, we're in for a really, really ferocious global argument about water. And it's starting already in the West, and it's going to spread very widely. So the question's a really good one about water. Part of freedom from passion in Gregory's mind is freedom from fighting over the finite resources of the earth, thinking that if I have water, you don't. And this is true, actually. If someone does have water, someone else may not, right? So we can channel water away from fields, et cetera. But the thought, that somebody owns water is absurd. In fact, legally, no one owns water, but you can own the means by which water is transported. That's very true. But secondly, for Gregory, the problem is that, and I'm not going to get him to adjudicate your case, right? That's not the way he's thinking. But thinking about it, one of the things we have a difficult time thinking about is a goodness that's not sensible, as in known by our senses. And if we judge what is good and evil by our senses, that is the worst form for Gregory. I'm not saying we have to agree with him, by the way, but the worst form of judging good and evil is judging by what our bodily senses tell us is good, right? And then the second form you have to transcend is what your intellect tells you is good, right? So we'll get to that in a minute. But so the first form is what we're arguing about with water is bodily water for the use of our bodies, which is all a very good thing. But for Gregory, that's not even close to being goodness itself, right? Goodness itself is that for which you're willing to lay down your life, right? So the martyrs, and he had martyrs in his extended family, the martyrs are the ones who are willing to die for the goodness of God because they know that this life is not good. It's good, but it's not goodness itself. So you shouldn't give your life to this life. You should give your life to God, right? So that would be the way I could try to parse out the question. But in terms of settling a water dispute, which is really, as I said, these are going to be disputes we're going to be having even more. But so it's an excellent question. It just doesn't fit quite the way he's setting things up, at least the way I was setting things up for him. So is there nothing? One of the interesting things about studying historical figures is they don't answer our questions, but they get us to ask questions we never thought about. And so you're absolutely right. And I'm not going to be able to take another question yet, or we're not going to get anywhere. So because we are now going down another railroad track. But yes, in our era, the obsession is, and I would actually disagree with Bishop Tutu. I think Christianity today is nothing but God loves you. And it doesn't ask anything of us. It just asks over and over again, can you assure me even more, given my own exclusion from certain forms of human society, that God loves me? It's a very important thing to talk about. But no one is asked, do you love God? Right? And what does it mean to love God? Now, I personally think if you spend your whole life just wanting God to love you, it's like spending your whole life wanting your wife to love you. It's narcissistic, isn't it? It's like, do you love me? Can you imagine a relationship in which you never worry about how you love your partner or your child? All you want to know is, my son Johnny, do you love me, Johnny? Do you love me, Johnny? No, really assure me you love me, Johnny. It's really important to me to know that you love me, Johnny. It's like, get over yourself. Right? So for Gregory, our love for God is based on what we're experiencing right now, all the time. Right? It's just that we're not paying attention. So sin is thoughtlessness. And if you say you don't have the capacity to love God or desire God, you're just not paying attention. Right? So pay attention to the energies that God is already giving you in your life, and that will draw you to God. Right? It won't just be love. It's not just self-sacrificial love. This is desire. This will lead you to desire that which is genuinely good for you. Right? And so that would be his way of flipping it around. I take your point about God loving us. This is what the Reformation was about. When we get to the Reformation, we'll get to that. But I personally think modern Christianity is completely in a dead end on this issue. It's like a marriage where one partner is asking the other one all the time, do you love me? Do you love, well, I did this. Do you love me? Do you love me? It's like, where's the reciprocity? Right? Where's the human response? Where's the human responsibility for this relationship? So I think your question is a really good one, but actually Gregory is interested in a very different thing, which is, why do we desire a good which isn't genuinely good? Why do we desire a good that leads to conflict, that leads to strife, that leads to envy, that leads to warfare, that leads to deception, that leads to murder? And it's because we're pursuing the wrong thing as the good. Right? We're using our bodies to judge what is good. We're even using our intellects to judge what is good, but we're not judging the self-revelation, using the self-revelation of God to judge what is good. We're not being drawn by the energies of God to the source of those energies, and that would be what his point is, without excluding God's love for us. But Gregory really isn't that interested in that. It's really interesting. He's much more interested in how we respond to God, and that doesn't mean we have to think that way. None of these figures are proposed for our agreement. It's just that they have certain insights that I think are really interesting. And this one's a very interesting one. So the first theophany, if you will, to Moses, and his life of Moses, when we're sort of tracking in his quotes, the first theophany to Moses is of light, right? So there's the burning bush on Mount Sinai. And then the name is proclaimed to Moses, I am that I am. And so this is very familiar to us, though, that the revelation of God would be in light, and then there would be a word, right? The I am that I am. And so for Gregory, the spiritual interpretation of this is that this is the revelation of that which truly exists, which is God, right? But then why then the next time Moses goes up Mount Sinai after they've been delivered from Egypt, the next time Moses goes up Mount Sinai, he encounters darkness. He doesn't encounter light, he encounters darkness. And that's where God is, the thick darkness where God is. So the initial theophany, I am that I am, that's light. But then the next theophany is thick darkness. And in order to understand that, we have to flip over the page. In order to understand that, you have to understand that the first misapprehension of being is judging it by our senses, right? And judging it by what our bodies tell us is good. And so the good is that which exists of itself, but then the intellect for Gregory needs to free itself even more from passion, even from its own intellectual capacities. The intellect needs to transcend itself, if you will, in order then to enter into where God really is. And that's in the second quote on page 160, quote number 162.
And Dr. Zachman, I know that we're winding down in our time. And this presentation is so powerful. I love that you highlighted the themes of freedom from passion, and for Gregory of Nyssa, one of the primary sins for him was envy. So if you were to kind of summarize and bring us to a close to allow people to maybe ask you questions after our session, how would you summarize Gregory's entire life in 2 minutes?
Well, I actually buy this quote, okay, and then I will stop. Yeah, so on right in the middle of the second page, and it is actually kind of a closing quote. He points out in 162 that initially there was a theophany of light, and now Moses enters into the thick darkness. And why is this? And then, so he gives his explanation of it in paragraph 163. And this does get to what I think is crucial to Gregory. So if God is infinite goodness itself, that means God really can't be comprehended even by the intellect. That's his point. For leaving behind everything that is observed, not only what sense comprehends, we've been talking about that, but also what the intelligence thinks it sees. So even leaving the intelligence's vision, it keeps on penetrating deeper until by the intelligence's yearning for understanding, it gains access to the invisible and the incomprehensible, and there it sees God. Right? So there's this yearning that the intellect has for that which is beyond the intellect. And when it follows that yearning, that desire, that was what I was talking about, that desire, it actually enters into the invisible and the incomprehensible, and there it sees God. But notice it's not going to see. This is the true knowledge of what is sought. This is the seeing that consists in not seeing. This is the seeing that consists in not seeing, because that which is sought transcends all knowledge, being separated on all sides by incomprehensibility as by a kind of darkness. Wherefore John the Sublime, that's the author of the gospel, who penetrated into the luminous darkness, I love that phrase, the luminous darkness, says no one has ever seen God, thus asserting that knowledge of the divine essence is unattainable, not only by men, but also by every intelligent creature. So that would be my closing thought for Gregory, is that he takes very seriously, if the divine is really infinite, then the divine is essentially incomprehensible, because to be incomprehensible means you can't wrap your mind around it, right? And so what would the greatest idol become? A concept that you say is God, right? And that's the very next, the second to the last thing. Every concept which comes from some comprehensible image by an approximate understanding and by guessing at the divine nature constitutes an idol of God and does not proclaim God. So if we think that a metaphor for God or a concept of God comprehends God, fully defines God, then we've created an idol, because God is essentially incomprehensible. That doesn't mean we can't use language to talk about God, but the language in a way has to dissolve itself. It has to be able to be transcended. The intellect has to be transcended, etc. So I think it's really a rather remarkable vision that he has of seeing what can't be seen. So that would be my summary.
That is an awesome cliffhanger. Tune in next week, folks. To learn more. Thank you, Dr.